All right, good afternoon, and welcome to City and State's latest live digital discussion on the response to the coronavirus pandemic. I'm John Lentz, City and State's Editor-in-Chief. I'm pleased to welcome today's guests, Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, Chair of the House Small Business Committee, Gregg Bishop, Commissioner of New York City Department of Small Business Services, or SBS, and Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer. Thanks for joining us. Before we begin a few things. First, a word from our sponsors today. Thank you to our healthcare partner on this summit, Affinity Health Plan. With the unprecedented job loss due to the current health crisis, Affinity Health Plan is here as a resource to help educate the thousands of New Yorkers affected about the health coverage options available to them. And thanks to our sponsor, CDW. As the coronavirus situation continues to evolve, we know it presents extraordinary obstacles. Our focus is on helping our customers navigate a rapidly changing environment while ensuring the safety and well-being of our coworkers, communities, and suppliers. Now for our audience, there's a few functions on Zoom I'd like to point out. To ask a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll take a few audience questions as time permits. You can also interact with the other attendees through the chat function, also at the bottom of your screen. Please use the drop-down box and share comments with all attendees, not just the panelists. And please do keep it civil and on point. And with Zoom, you can also change the view settings on the top right-hand corner of your screen. Now, briefly back to our guests. Gregg Bishop is a commissioner of the New York City Department of Small Business Services. He's been in the role since 2015 and is focused on equity of opportunity, economic self-sufficiency, and mobility for New York City's diverse communities. In response to the economic crisis brought by the coronavirus, Bishop's agency has been helping small business owners seeking assistance and guidance. Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer was elected in 2013 after years in the New York City Council, and has been one of the more proactive borough presidents in recent memory, both legislatively and in shaping land use decisions. Over the past couple of months, her office has also been fielding calls from many struggling business owners. And finally, Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez, a true trailblazer in Washington. In 1992, she became the first Puerto Rican woman elected to the House of Representatives, the first Hispanic woman to serve as ranking member and chair of a full House committee. She became chair of the House Small Business Committee in 2019. This committee oversees the Small Business Administration, which is playing a critical role in the economic response to the pandemic. And throughout her career, she has emphasized serving minorities, immigrants, and lower income New Yorkers, a commitment that has continued through this crisis. And we'll start with you, Congresswoman. I know you have about 30 minutes before you have to hop off. And first of all, just want to ask, how are you? I know you had a presumed infection from coronavirus. Are you fully recovered?
Yeah, thank you, John, first and foremost, for putting together this event at this time where so many Americans are suffering the implications of the pandemic, whether it's health issues or economic issues. And I am proud to join you with Gale Brewer and Gregg Bishop. I have fully recovered. I did a antivirus antibody, and it corroborated what we all thought. Yes, I had the coronavirus and I have full recovered. Lucky, I am one of the lucky ones, and went to Washington last week to work on behalf of small businesses in our nation.
Sure, certainly. And this is a very timely topic, any week, but especially this week. A second round of funding became available for small businesses through the federal Paycheck Protection Program. The first round, totaling, I think, $350 billion, ran out in 2 weeks or less. And so Congress appropriated another $310 billion. Is this enough?
Well, so the issue that we have right now is that in order to address whether or not there's sufficient money, and my guess is not, my educated guess, this is too deep, too many businesses are suffering. We need data and transparency, and I've been asking that from Treasury and the Small Business Administration. We need to know what businesses are getting the money, geographically and economically, if it has been fair, the distribution of that money, and if every corner of America has benefited out of that money. So without the data, we do not know. I don't know if there has been concentration of relief assistance to particular areas, to geographic areas, and if they are, how does it compare? Rural America, inner cities, minority communities, women, farmers, small farmers. So it's very difficult for us to judge and assess whether or not we need to do more and how.
One following up on that, there have also been multiple reports of delays with this program. Even this week, people had trouble applying for funding. The first time around, many businesses failed to secure badly needed funding, while others, you've seen the stories, Shake Shack, Harvard, the Los Angeles Lakers, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Given all this, how would you grade the government's efforts to assist small business? And we'll start with you, Congressman. I'll also give the Commissioner and the Borough President a chance to respond to that.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, Congressman, if you want to start.
Yes, look, when we put together the first tranche of money, $349 billion, it was to provide capital to those small businesses in America. And we in Congress intended for the law to specifically address the issue of lack of capital and how we could help businesses weather this crisis. To find out that publicly traded companies had benefited, that is not what the law intended. It is the responsibility of the federal agencies, in this case, Treasury and the Small Business Administration, to issue clear guidance to the small businesses and to the lenders. And apparently, there has been a vacuum. There has been a lot of confusion when they wanted to roll out this immediately. And I always said, take your time and do it right so that we avoid glitches and the rollout of the entire program, and it's showing today.
Sure.
Yesterday at 10:30, they were supposed to start to open up the new tranche of money, and immediately the ATRAN system at SBA overloaded, and they had to shut it down.
Sure. Commissioner?
So, John, thanks for having me. And I think, that's one of the challenges that we have seen. At SBS, we've been working to help our small businesses, very small businesses, understand the documents that they need to put together. But in terms of when you think about the legislation and intent of the legislation, I want to thank, Congressman Velázquez and the entire New York delegation. And I would give them an A for effort because they knew that they needed to move quickly. If you remember, after Hurricane Sandy, we got caught up in politics and aid took forever to come to New York City. But here you have legislation passing. And then within what I think was about 10 days, you have a program launch. Now, in terms of execution, I would probably give it a D because you have the banks who have traditionally, and I've said this time and time again, since 2008, since the bailout, banks are not focused on small businesses.
Right.
They are not necessarily interested in providing the technical assistance. The level of lending is just not worth it. And we saw that where they prioritized their larger businesses to get these loans. And I think that is something that, we have, and we were very upset about. But thanks to the Congresswoman, this new round has a set aside for our smaller lenders and our CDFIs. So I would say that in terms of execution, there was definitely some faults, and the Congresswoman is absolutely right. Guidance did not come down to the banks until the night before execution. Two of our largest banks here in New York City did not start participating and accepting applications until about 4 or 5 days later. And as you know, first come, first serve only serves big businesses. So if you're 5 days delayed and you don't work with small businesses, you're just compounding the pain and suffering from our small businesses.
Sure. And Borough President, over to you.
Well, in my situation, what I get are the problems, but I want to say that to the credit of the Congress member and the amazing commissioner, you know, you talk about people rising to the occasion, they both have, and that's been an amazing opportunity to see real leadership supporting these small businesses. The challenge that we heard first was, obviously the city was the very first to come up with some funding, and you know, nothing is fits all small businesses and nonprofits, but they certainly did a huge effort, whether it was a loan or a grant. And then came the feds, and you know, we knew that it would be a first come, first serve, and everybody was rushing. I don't think we knew about the bank problem as clearly as maybe the Congresswoman and the commissioner. So we started getting all of these complaints. On the other hand, there was, thanks to the delegation and certainly the union, there was a real push to have gig workers and independent contractors. And that was a huge plus because that had never happened before. And I'm sure it was because of our delegation. So from my perspective, because, you know, now we're dealing with the next round, you might get the PPP, but the next round, according to the restaurants that I talked to, how am I going to keep all my workers up to June 20th? I'd like to have it until the end of the year. So how can we change the wording so that it will fit my restaurant? So I would agree that we learned a lot. I think that the example of, Shake Shack turning back the money was an example where many of the other companies should have done the same, because it's clear that they didn't need it. And it is the local, like in East Harlem and Harlem, which is where I spend a lot of time talking to the businesses, they really are not able to access in any kind of a meaningful way. So what we're all trying to do is find other creative ways. Like we were managing at the Metropolitan Hospital, we got some private money from developers, and they are paying 20 East Harlem restaurants for a month and a half, they've started already, to feed the workers at Metropolitan. That's great. It's a win-win for the workers, it's a win-win for the restaurants, but not everybody can do that. So we have to, I'm afraid, because not all of this funding is going to save our nonprofits and our businesses. We could talk more about the nonprofits. We have to come up with other innovative ways of supporting, because I don't know between the city, the state, and the federal, if we're going to be able to do what we want with particularly our mom and pops and our smaller businesses. But it's not for lack of trying, because the commissioner and the Congress member know exactly what's needed, but it's not so easy to get the banks and the powers that be Republicans to agree to what they need.
Sure. One Congresswoman, I wanted to ask you about today's news on CNBC. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin said that companies that got more than $2 million through this program could be audited or would be audited by the Small Business Administration and could face, quote, criminal liability if they were indeed ineligible for this money. What's your reaction to that development?
Well, I welcome that. And for sure, it is due to the oversight that we exerted last week. I held a congressional hearing, a bipartisan congressional hearing, where I have 56 members of Congress who came before the committee to talk to us about the shortcoming of the execution and the rollout of the program. But yet, when they came before the House to debate this legislation, all they care about was not to point to the issues that small businesses were confronting, but rather criticizing Democrats for holding the vote for almost 2 weeks. And those 2 weeks, we used those 2 weeks to negotiate another $50 billion for disaster loans that is going to leverage $377 billion, and a grant program for those who apply for the disaster loan to get money to up to $10,000. That is money that you don't have to pay back. So they criticize us because I wanted to make the changes to make this program more efficient and to make sure that we diversified and that we brought in new mission-based lenders, such as CDFIs, CDCs, micro lenders. These are, and community banks and credit unions. These are the type of financial institutions that have deep ties in our communities. So in order to guarantee that minority businesses, that women-owned businesses, that mom and pop, Main Street America have a chance to access capital, that's why we were holding this bill to come to the floor. So for Mnuchin now to announce that they're going to audit $2 million, it's kind of little late, because last week I was pointing out to the 80 publicly traded companies that didn't have any business applying for money that they could easily get from their own financial institutions, whether it's JP Morgan or Chase Manhattan. So I welcome it, and I just want to hear from him if he's going to ask every company that got the maximum 10 million. And beyond that, there were other companies that got 10 millions, and that was against the law. So I want to hear that he's going to go and ask them to return that money.
And following up on that, you mentioned transparency already, and I went back, you did an interview on NY1, I believe is on the day that the first round of funding ran out for this program, and you had called for greater transparency. I believe we don't even know who is getting this funding unless a company chooses to disclose it, correct?
Yes.
Any improvement on that front? Any greater transparency we'll see?
So last week, I held a briefing with the SBA administrator and the members of the Small Business Committee. And I asked the administrator that I wanted to have access to all the data, not only on the number of loans, the amount of loans, the size of those loans, and the individuals or companies, the entities that were getting those loans. She said she's gonna make that data available to us this week. Still, we're waiting.
And then one other story I wanted to ask you about. There's this point I think was raised already about these going out on a first come, first served basis. Though on April 22nd, the Times reported that they were not in fact delivered in this way. They said, quote, "That's because some of the nation's biggest banks, including JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, and US Bank, prioritize the applications of their wealthiest clients before turning to other loan seekers. In addition, they looked at some of the data you could see. Loans of more than 1 million made up just 4% of those approved, but they sucked up 45% of the dollars disbursed." Can you respond to that?
Well, like Commissioner Bishop said, the big lenders do not lend to small businesses. Those loans, those small loans from 100, 25,000, 50,000, 200, they're not profitable. They're making money because they're charging fees. Already those banks made $10 billion in fees. And the law doesn't require or doesn't say anything about these financial institutions lending to their pre-existing customers. They're supposed to lend to those who apply in the order that they apply. You know, this is our money. They're not putting this money. They are lending it. We are paying for it, and we are paying on top of that fees. So we're gonna do an audit, and we want to see, and by the way, I wrote to the IG of SBA asking for an investigation and to see whether or not the banks put aside all those borrowers who submitted their application, and instead they decided to go with their preferred customers.
Then I'll pivot over to the commissioner and the borough president. Anything you're hearing or seeing, you know, certain kinds of companies getting funding, others not? What are you seeing on the ground at the city level, at the borough level? Commissioner, let's start with you.
Yeah, so, you know, I've seen, and one of the things that the borough president talked about, the inclusion of like nonprofits, et cetera. So I've heard that there are companies that are successfully actually not only getting funding through the PPP, but there are individuals who got the emergency grant, et cetera. Even our program, we have, and we had about 50 million, as the mayor talked about today, and we were quickly overwhelmed, as the borough president talked about. We've been able to disperse about $19 million, approved $19 million in grants, and about $8 million in loans of a $22 million fund, which is why we were really focused on connecting our small businesses to the federal program, because only the federal government has the resources to match this need. Our city budget has to be balanced, the state budget has to be balanced. We're facing huge deficits, but the federal government budget doesn't have to be balanced. So that's why we need them to respond. But I am hearing, small businesses, medium-sized businesses, but it's scattered. But what I'm hearing more of is the smaller micro businesses. And this is important. 70% of our businesses in New York City are small micro businesses. They're the fabric of the city. They're the ones that have a relationship with your community banks and with your CDFIs. They don't have a larger relationship with a large bank. And they were the ones that were cut out of the first process. So we're hoping for a different result in the second process.
Well, from my perspective, it's not just as the commissioner stated, the small businesses in Harlem and Washington Heights and Lower East Side, but it is scattered. For instance, I know the South Street Seaport Museum got some money in the first round. That's a nonprofit that desperately needs it. But the issue is the small businesses are feeling so overwhelmed. Maybe they get money, but then they still have to deal with the fact that the percentage doesn't necessarily work for New York in terms of rent, which is going to be their challenge. And I know you're trying to change that in the next round of federal funding. And then they have the insurance companies who say, sorry, this is not something that we can fund. So I just, for instance, I got an email today from bars, some of the bars in New York. And who knows when they're going to open? We don't know, because it's obviously hard to social distance in a bar. Maybe it can be worked out. But they are feeling, that they might get some money, but then there's so many other issues that are attached to that federal money that they don't know if it'd be able to be a loan or a grant. And so they're nervous about loan. So it's a very complicated, you have to keep peeling back the onion, and then you see how can we keep addressing these issues. But I want to say, John, one of the great things about this is that between the city, state, and the New York delegation, they really are figuring out where the onion has to be peeled back to address these challenges. And maybe we learned some from 9/11 and some from Sandy, but we really do see the underpinnings now, and obviously much more support to go to the smaller banks and the credit unions, and the big banks have really been a hindrance, and I'm trying to be nice about them in this particular situation, because if in fact they had acted as they were supposed to, we would have had perhaps a different scenario for the third opportunity, and certainly maybe with some of the city money. So I think the banks are bad guys, the big banks in this particular scenario, and we have to figure out how to deal with them in the future, because that's where I got the most complaints.
I think that there's an opportunity for them to actually correct that behavior. So we'll see. But you're touching on a point really quickly, is in order for this loan to be forgivable, there's a number of documentations that you have to submit at the tail end of this. And if you're a small business, and that is some of the things we're thinking about, is what's the level of technical assistance we're going to need to provide our smaller businesses to make sure they get the documentation in on time so the loan could be forgiven. Because if it's not, then you're talking about I believe it's like an 18-month loan, which that is a huge impact on your cash flow.
Yeah, and Congresswoman, back to you. Anything else you see in this program that you'd like to amend or change? I mean, should there be an extended timeline to hit these benchmarks to have loans forgiven?
Sure.
Should there be more documentation required up front? And anything else?
So last week and the week before last week, we were working with the Senate, and I was telling the Senate, Senator Rubio, that places like New York, where you have a state in order, what is
Shelter in place.
Shelter in place,
Yep.
that you need more than 8 weeks.
Correct.
Because for the restaurant, for example, it doesn't work.
Correct.
So why are we designing a program that is going to be so restrictive, it will not be helpful to small businesses. So I try to change the timeline. I try to put in place to give more flexibility to the program. For example, the ratio of 75-25.
That's right.
So it's very difficult for many businesses to bring everyone. Once you open, once the restrictions are lifted. So I wanted to give more flexibility for the businesses to be able to use more than just 25% to pay mortgage and operations and management. And also to extend the time for them to rehire. Because what we are trying to do is to protect workers, is to keep our workforce, but it cannot be so restrictive that then it doesn't provide an option for small businesses.
Sure, and then I know you have to hop off momentarily, Congresswoman. Any other programs, we've talked about PPP, I think most of the time here, any other loans or types of assistance you want to touch on, or other things that Congress should look at more broadly going forward to help small businesses?
Sure. So, well, I invite small businesses also to look at the disaster loan program because it's less restrictive. It is just 3.75 interest rate with a 30-year term to pay it back. So it gives them more flexibility, but also to know that you could apply for both PPP and the disaster loan. And I invite, we have been conducting with Commissioner Bishop a lot of the teleconference town hall, and we will continue to do that. Next week, we will continue to do hearings. So if anyone, any of the businesses out there, and I know that you have been calling the office, and believe me, I am hearing you loud and clear. One of the areas that I want to bring more oversight into the program, to get the IG to do the investigation, we need to send a very strong message to the administration that we are watching and that they better bring transparency as a hallmark of any program going forward, because the American people are hurting and they need to trust that the federal agencies are doing right by them.
Sure. And one last question, while I have a minute here before you hop off, Congresswoman. Very big picture, you know, here we are, the richest country in the world, struggling to get this right, where you've seen other countries have a kind of a system in place. Should the American system be fundamentally changed? Should we not be playing catch up so much relative to other countries in terms of helping employees and small businesses?
Well, there's so many things that this pandemic has been able to expose. One of them is the health disparity among the American people, and especially those that come from low-income communities that are working in the service industry. Those workers, they don't have the luxury of staying home and working out of their homes. They either show up or they lose their homes, their jobs, and so there's no consideration for some of them whether or not to stay home or go out there and expose themselves to this pandemic. So there is the healthcare disparity that has been exposed and the economic disparity that exists in this country. And we need to deal with those issues. And one example is the PPP and the money that has been allocated. How can we make sure? Can you imagine that we have to fight tooth and nail to make sure that the small employer with 4 or 5 workers have access to a $25,000 or $50,000? What the Trump administration says Well, we shouldn't be in the business of deciding quotas in lending opportunities. Well, there's not a level playing field. Those who have, that have the connection, the wealthy who are connected, they have an easy way to get access to capital. The unfairness is that this program was designed to help those who have, that are unbanked, that come from low-income communities, minority communities, and that do not have pre-existing lending institutions relationships. That is what is at stake here, and that is the unfairness of the system that we have to deal with.
Congresswoman,
how can we bring fairness when it comes to any program that is designed to help everyday Americans?
Understood. Congresswoman, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you have to jump off for another obligation. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And it's always a pleasure, Gale and Bishop, to be with you.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
And we'll continue on with the SBS Commissioner and the Manhattan Borough President. First of all, anything that either of you want to respond to that we heard from the Congresswoman just now?
Yeah, so I think there, oh, sorry, Gale.
Great, go.
Yeah.
Go. No,
so
go.
There's two other programs that I just want to make sure that all your viewers are aware of, which is often not talked about, which is the SBA Express Bridge Loan that allows individuals to get access to about $25,000 quickly, and also the SBA debt relief. So that's important because if you're a small business, you probably already have a loan that's backed by the SBA, and they are automatically going to pay the principal and interest and fees issued for loans issued prior to September 27th, 2020. So that's important for your existing debt. And we have a website full of resources that's available at nyc.gov/COVID-19-BIZ. So that's COVID-19 BIZ, where you can learn about some of the other SBA programs that could be helpful at this time.
I just want to add, the Congresswoman is so correct in terms of the challenges of the federal government. But I want to, in addition to thanking Greg Bishop and SBS, I also want to thank EDC for something that has happened. And we have to keep looking at what we need to change after this horrific COVID. The first is EDC, and I certainly got swamped with, we have, masks, we have gloves, we have shields, and they're all coming from another country. And it makes no sense, in my opinion. And I was also a huge supporter of the Garment Center. In fact, if it wasn't for me, the Garment Center in Manhattan anyway may not exist. It does exist. And we have a little bit of manufacturing, and certainly in all 5 boroughs, we have manufacturers of garment and of other things like face shields. Long story short, to the credit of EDC, they must have evaluated and vetted a gazillion different manufacturers from all over the world, and they have focused on New York City. So the Garment Center, Brooklyn, probably Queens, and certainly Adafruit, which is a manufacturer in Manhattan, they're all working. So I guess what I want to say as a result of this horrific virus is we need to look local. We need to find a way to be more focused on keeping our local businesses busy and using our resources to do that. If there's one thing that came out of this is that whether it is figuring out how to deal with some of our state and local issues, but also making sure now we know the bank situation. We know where we need to put our efforts. So, it's been very, very hard on so many levels, as you've heard, but I think we have to think very differently and outside the box as we go forward. I just want to mention that, because it cannot be the same in the future if these small businesses are going to survive. Government needs to be part of the solution in addition to the private sector.
Sure, I wanted to jump on that. I've actually given that some thought. Are there other, I guess there are a few examples I've seen of certain businesses or sectors that are struggling, and maybe they get plugged in to help with the emergency response. Uber drivers delivering food to people who can't get it. Talk of, or maybe some actual use of hotels, either for the homeless or talk of using that for people who are quarantined, paying restaurants who don't have business anymore to provide food, connect upstate farmers with downstate food pantries that are closing down. How well is the city and state doing in finding those kind of connections, facilitating that? Is there room for more? And who would drive that, if anyone?
Commissioner, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think, we have, and one of the things that I'm really proud of is the fact that we have so many different groups within City Hall. So, for example, the Office of MWBE has been actively looking at emergency contracting opportunities and making sure that our MWBEs are connected to those. We've been working with the Food Czar, to your point, to make sure that the businesses, the essential businesses, we make a connection for them to acquire the PPEs that's necessary for their employees. We even, because we are working remotely, our Workforce One Center, we're helping over 150 businesses try to source over 1,600 positions, whether they're grocery stores or healthcare. So there's a number of connection points. And I think the mayor has been very strategic in terms of creating these groups to make sure that we address the inequalities that you're talking about, and figure out ways. And I thought the same thing too, Borough President. How important, coming out of this, how important the manufacturing sector is to the city. And the fact that we had manufacturers in the Navy Yard, we had manufacturers in the Brooklyn Army Terminal, we have manufacturers actually in Queens, Boyce Technologies, who are making such critical equipment. And they're often overlooked. And in this administration, we've made investments in our business providers to provide them the necessary support that they need. But it's great that they're actually being a spotlight on them, because that is evident. I think what you're going to see coming out of this is the nation as a whole will reevaluate our supply chain and figure out ways we can make that connection to the local businesses. I've always talked about how important anchor institutions, whether it's hospitals, government, what you name it, how important it is for them to develop a strategy to connect to local small businesses, because that's how you grow a small business, is to get them the contract opportunity that they need.
Well, I certainly agree. For instance, we had a meeting virtually, of course, with all the business improvement districts in the borough of Manhattan. And that's actually where the idea of open roads and streets came, because they're trying to figure out what is it that our small restaurants are going to need when we recover. And one of the ideas would be, to be honest with you, would be to have some open streets in areas where the sidewalks are very narrow, so that people would feel more comfortable going to the commercial sector. Again, all of this to be worked out, but everything has to be on the table. The second issue is I'm on the board of NYC and Company, and they do a great job, the tourism arm of the city government, of figuring out what recovery looks like, because it's going to have to be Broadway, it's going to have to be the restaurants, it's going to have to be the hospitality sector. That's our manufacturing sector, although I love the garment center and other places where manufacturing goes on to be increased in any way, shape, or form. But tourism is what we have been surviving on, and you know how many gazillion jobs are involved there. So in terms of the tourism, again, thinking more realistically, according to NYC and Company and the great Fred Dixon, it's going to be local. It's going to be Pennsylvania. It's going to be Massachusetts. It's going to be the New England and states down to DC. Start there. People coming to New York, they're not going to fly in necessarily. They're not going to travel long distances. And you mentioned the hotels. Something like 80% of them are not making any money, and a few are from the city. It's very small. Some of them are not charging, like the Four Seasons, and then some are charging them the full amount from the city, in terms of those who are who need isolation and are homeless, or those who are recovering, or those who are healthcare workers. But maybe that's, some kind of business for the future. We don't know. We do have to think differently. And I think the Uber idea is a phenomenal one, where the yellow cab Uber are actually getting serious money per taxi and limousine to do something that is necessary, because from the very beginning, I've been working with the seniors and trying to get them food. And if you're shut in and you're a senior and there's nobody to help you, you do need somebody to help you get that food. So again, all of this, maybe that's going to continue. I don't know. Well, these are ways that we have to think differently. And government, thank goodness in New York City is creative and does have different people thinking differently. I think the mayor has a task force to think about recovery. I'm sure the governor will have a task force to think about recovery. And these are some of the ways that I think they can go about it.
Sure. Before I ask another question, I just want to note to our audience, we're getting a number of good questions here. Please, if you're putting those in the chat function, add those over to the Q&A button. You click the Q&A button, it pulls it up. You can pose a question. Also, if you want to scan through those, you can upvote. You can click a thumbs up. And if a lot of you want a specific question, I'll move it up to the top. But I just wanted to note kind of a broad takeaway here. We did a recent post on a half dozen or so New York City institutions that could be permanently shut down as a result of this economic crisis: the Tenement Museum, Upright Citizens Brigade, Forbidden Planet NYC. Is this just the beginning? Will we come out of this in a city that has even fewer unique small businesses that give the city its character?
So, first of all, we are a resilient city. New York City has been left for dead so many times. In the 70s, certainly 9/11, we were concerned about the future of the city. Hurricane Sandy, ravaged so many of our critical areas in the city. But we came back, and we came back stronger. So I have every confidence that our small businesses will come back stronger. As you saw the Congresswoman, but we have to fight. We have to fight for fairness in our financial industry. We have to be smart about what the recovery looks like because, one of the things that the mayor has always talked about is like we have to be careful in terms of the reopen. That's why the task force have been created to make sure that we have the brightest minds. And we are talking to small business owners. There's a small business task force. So we're going to talk about, what does that reopening look like? I will say that we all play a part in this. It's the private sector, it's government, but it's also the insurance industry. What has been left, we haven't talked about this, and I've been the champion of this in terms of reminding folks that we have business interruption insurance for a reason. And I totally understand that the industry is concerned about if every single business files a claim, we will go bankrupt, and there's unintended consequences there. But if you are smart about how you do that, even if you put some limits on how much those claims can be, the insurance industry could solve that capital problem that we're seeing right now. The reason why there's such a deluge of businesses coming to government, whether it's local or federal, for capital, is there's a desperate need for capital. But the industry is sitting on almost $800 billion of reserves that, yes, we know that they need reserves for a major event. Well, what is this? I mean, this is the pandemic. None of us have ever gone through this. So, staying by the rules in terms of what's exempt, what's not. Congress, I think, need to be smart about this, and we need to put pressure that they come up with a solution like they did with 9/11 that allow the industry to cover the terrorism events, but in a strategic, smart way that did not cause any stress on their ability to then cover future events. So I think, a combination of government, the private sector, and our insurance industry all pitching in, all of our landmarks, all of our small businesses will have the necessary tools to come back, not only to come back, but to come back stronger. Because I'll tell you this, John, a lot of retail businesses are looking at, wait a minute, so many people are still ordering online. I need to strengthen my ability to actually deliver online. I need to be able to have an e-commerce strategy. We've been pushing a lot of our free resources, educational resources online. So if you're a small business owner, now is a great time, and you're closed and your store is closed, you can go online, register for some of our classes, and learn about an e-commerce strategy, learn about logistics and last mile delivery. So when you come out of this, you're stronger, you're better positioned for the new New York City.
I agree. I'm optimistic because New Yorkers are resilient, but I'm worried. I know Chinatown is an example where they were having challenges way before this horrible virus, in the sense that they were still hurting from 9/11. Yep. And they're still hurting because, tourism going there has some wayfinding challenges, just in terms of the police department having to close off some of the streets. So I mean, a place like Chinatown, we were having luncheons there, bringing staff and friends even before the shutdown because we were so nervous about tourism not going there. So that's an example of, yes, we could try to do insurance changes, rent changes, as much funding as possible, but even getting the technology, which is sort of what you're talking about for the future, into Chinatown or into some of these smaller mom and pop restaurants is hard because they haven't done it. I know when I was on the phone with the bid, obviously when we were talking downtown, everybody had technology. When you talk to Washington Heights, the head of the bid has to go door to door, or he has to find the phone of the business that's closed and the cell phone of the owner. So we have a lot of work to do. And some of it is we need less expensive technology, and we need more ubiquitous, in my opinion, free Wi-Fi. So those issues are real in terms of getting some of the communities that have been disenfranchised in the past to catch up. It's almost like in other parts of the world, they skipped the phone and they just went to cell phone. And here, in some cases, we're not even at the cell phone level. We're not there yet. So there's a lot of work on that front. And the second thing I want to just say about, you know, whether it's insurance or rent, rent is a big challenge. We know sure that every owner, small, if in particular, small owners, I've had this conversation on so many Zooms, they need money. They have to pay their mortgage. And if they don't pay the mortgage, then of course the bank is going to be on their case. But if you can't pay your bank and you can't pay the mortgage, I mean, then because the rent's not coming in. Now, when I talk to restaurants and they're getting PP money, the first thing they say is, I'm going to pay my workers, I'm going to get my inventory, and the rent's going to come later. So that whole issue of rent is also part of this recovery, I think. I also, the issue that I know the commissioner, to his credit, is trying to wrestle with is the issue of undocumented. I was talking to one of the unions yesterday because some of the unions, as you know, have low-wage workers. They've been laid off. In most cases, the unions, you know that they will be rehired, but there's a time period until this happens, and in that time period, obviously you can apply for unemployment. We can talk more about unemployment fitting into the PPP and who gets rehired is another sort of how do we coordinate all of that? Because some folks say unemployment gives me more money, so I may not come back to work. You know, those are issues that are also addressable, but something to look at. But if you're undocumented and you're working, then you're not going to be able to get some of this federal money. So how do we handle that? The unions actually, in some cases, are just doing fundraisers, trying to make sure that they can get something for these families. And I know the city has been looking at that also. So like I said, if you peel back the onion, even though we're very resilient, there are still aspects of our city that are going to have a very difficult time because they had challenging times before. And I just think we have to really look even harder at some of them.
Yeah, I think, so sorry, John, just really quickly on the rent issue, that is one of the reasons why we are providing free legal assistance. We know there's legislation right now being talked about, but in the meantime, I think, you know, for business owners who are concerned about that, the first thing is to connect with us. We can connect you with a free attorney. They can go to nyc.gov, the same page I gave out, nyc.gov/COVID-19 BIZ, click on legal assistance. They can get a free attorney, not only to help them on understanding some of their contractual issues, but looking at a lease, figuring out how they can work with their landlord to get some type of deferment or something in terms of negotiating. So it's so important that our small businesses have the resources that's necessary while we figure out the entire rent issue.
Sure. The Borough president mentioned in passing the insurance issue. I know, Commissioner, you've spoken about the challenges for small businesses in filing business interruption claims with the industry. Is this a paperwork issue, a problem with insurance or insurers, or a policy legislative question? Is that also a question for Albany or a question for Washington?
Yeah, I think the scale of this is definitely a question for Washington. You know, the challenge is it's really in the policy. And we all know this, like, you know, we all have, whether you have, you know, apartment insurance or rental insurance or car insurance, when you file a claim, the question is, am I going to get covered, right? And inside those policies, there's exemptions, et cetera. Well, most and a lot of business interruption insurance, and business interruption insurance is so important because it's exactly for this purpose. I cannot operate my business. I have losses. I need to file a claim to get those losses covered. But in those some policies, there is an exemption that says bacteria or virus. And so what we're seeing is that business owners who are calling their insurance companies, rightfully so, I've been paying my premiums for the past 20 years I've had my business. Now's the time I need my partner that's been with me and that has reassured me that if anything happens, I'm going to be there with you. You're getting the, sorry, this is not covered. So what we're saying is that we understand if you open it up and you legislate that the insurance company has to cover everyone, well, the unintended consequences, you're going to bankrupt the insurance industry. But we have to be smart about this. And in some cases, some individuals may not actually have that exemption in their business interruption insurance in policy. So we are offering, and we partnered with the City Bar Justice Center for individuals to get an attorney to look at their insurance policy and to figure out the strategy in terms of how they can make that claim. Because there's different ways you can make that claim. When we issued the executive order, we also talked about physical damage, which could be, it's a long shot, but it could be something that you can use. So we've been at the very forefront in terms of connecting individuals to attorneys to actually help them review their policy. But on a policy level, I have been advocating that Congress really needs to look at this. I know the insurance companies, obviously they have their lobbyists in Washington. And again, our small businesses, there's no small, like a small business doesn't have a lobbyist lobbying for them, right? So it is our job as the agency that's responsible for small businesses to point out the challenges that they face. And our elected officials on the city, state, and certainly on the federal level can put pressure on the industry to figure out ways to be part of the solution.
Sure. And we just have a few minutes left, 5 minutes or so. We've got a few questions from the audience on immigrants. One, how can immigrant micro businesses or micro business owners apply for these programs, folks like street vendors? And also, can you address what resources undocumented immigrants can access or that can be accessed for them? GoFundMe is not enough.
Yeah, and that is absolutely correct. And our immigrant community is such a rich, vibrant community here in New York City and part of the heart and soul of the city. As the borough president alluded to, the philanthropic sector is going to have to step in here. Unfortunately, the federal government, and there is suggestions to put in, whether you have a social security number or an equivalent. We know that this conversation has to go across the aisles. Unfortunately, not to get political, but we do have an administration that's been very hostile to the immigrant communities, and an administration that lacks the vision in terms of how immigrants have built this, not only the city, but our economy. So, in absence of that, we have to figure out how, working as government with the philanthropic sector, how we can actually get resources to help that particular community in terms of creating programs that they can access. But as of right now, the federal programs are not necessarily friendly to immigrant, especially undocumented immigrant communities. And we are working and thinking through in terms of, and as we think through recovery, what we as a city can either work with the philanthropic community to address or advocate for to help the immigrant